Prepare to delve into the captivating world of ancient Greek mythology and little-known historical chapters that time's relentless march almost swallowed whole. These tales unfolded millennia ago beneath the majestic arches of marble temples and along winding, dusty paths, illuminated by the soft glow of olive oil lamps. They whisper of a time when gods walked among mortals, and every stone seemed to hold its own unique story. Discover these long-lost eras where myth and reality intertwined in a wondrous dance waiting to be told. There are moments when unbearable pain pierces the mind, threatening to shatter the very bounds of consciousness. Zeus, the mighty king of the gods, once faced an agony that transcended all earthly suffering. His skull felt as if it would burst apart, and not without reason. Something truly incredible did emerge from his head. This marvel was a fully formed goddess, clad in gleaming armor, spear in hand, and with a mind that would soon become the sharpest and most discerning on all of Olympus. However, to understand the true roots of this astonishing event, one must journey back in time, for this dramatic story began not with Zeus's agonizing headache, but with an ominous prophecy that robbed him of his peace. Mighty Zeus was captivated by Metis, a titaness whose very name embodied wisdom and cunning intelligence. Her beauty was undeniable, but Metis's true power lay in her ability to surpass anyone, even the supreme god himself, in foresight and shrewdness, though Zeus would never admit it aloud. She was not one of those goddesses who idly spent their days on clouds enjoying ambrosia. Instead, her mind was constantly at work, contemplating, planning, always several steps ahead. While other gods indulged in boisterous arguments and endless squabbles, Metis, in quiet contemplation, would already have found an elegant solution. She had a unique habit of tilting her head slightly in moments of deep thought, her gaze becoming distant, as if she could see horizons of possibility invisible to others. Zeus was utterly enchanted by this otherworldly perceptiveness. At last he had found someone whose intellect could match his power, someone who could help him rule the world with unprecedented wisdom. They married, and for a time their union seemed flawless. Metis offered Zeus invaluable advice on the most intricate matters, helping him navigate the complexities of divine politics. Her way of suggesting solutions was so subtle and gentle that Zeus often mistook them for his own ideas, a testament to her extraordinary intelligence. However, this idyll was shattered by an ominous prophecy. In Greek myths, prophecies rarely bode well and almost always prove inescapable. The revelation that came to Zeus was particularly disturbing. It foretold that Metis would bear 2 children. First, a daughter whose wisdom would surpass even Zeus's own, and then a son who would be even more powerful and ultimately overthrow his father from the throne. Zeus, incidentally, was well acquainted with this grim tradition. After all, this was precisely how he had treated his own father, Cronus, who, in turn, had overthrown his parent. It was a vicious, dysfunctional family lineage that Zeus, without a doubt, had no desire to continue. And so Zeus undertook what, in his mind, seemed the only logical course of action, though in essence it was an act of monstrous cruelty. He resorted to trickery, convincing Metis to transform into a harmless fly. And in that very instant, without hesitation, he swallowed her whole. One moment she was there, offering wise counsel and gentle smiles, and the next, she was gone, dissolved into Zeus's very divine essence. One might assume the story would end there, but divine pregnancies unfold quite differently from those of mortals. Métis was already carrying her child when she was swallowed, and this tiny future goddess continued her development within Zeus, taking root and gaining strength, quite literally, inside his own head. For many months, Zeus suffered from mounting, unbearable headaches. One can only imagine what it was like to try to govern the heavens and the earth when it felt as though someone was relentlessly hammering inside your skull. He tried every remedy known to him, powerful divine concoctions, ancient magical healings, and even deep meditation, but nothing brought relief. The pain only intensified, becoming increasingly unbearable. Other gods began to notice strange changes in Zeus's demeanor. In assemblies he might suddenly snap, lose his train of thought mid-sentence, or retreat into himself, pressing his palms to his temples, his gaze fixed on distant horizons. Hera, his wife, was particularly alarmed, though she probably already suspected her husband had once again gotten himself into some trouble. She was rarely wrong about such premonitions. Finally, when the torment reached its peak and became utterly unbearable, Zeus summoned Hephaestus, the skilled god of blacksmithing and all crafts. Hephaestus was certainly accustomed to the most unusual and sometimes absurd requests from his divine kin, but this one surpassed all expectations, proving truly extraordinary even by Olympian standards. "I need you to split my head open," Zeus declared, and one can assume his voice was not as calm as this narrative suggests. Hephaestus, with his practical mind, asked entirely reasonable questions. Why? How? Are you absolutely certain about this? But Zeus, at that moment, was beyond rational discourse. The pressure in his skull felt so colossal it could cleave Olympus itself. And so Hephaestus, with the impeccable precision of a true master, raised his axe. It was a magnificent tool, perfectly balanced and sharp enough to cleave even divine flesh. The other gods gathered around, watching the event unfold, likely keeping a respectful distance, anticipating the possibility of a dreadful outcome. The axe descended with a thunderous sound, like a clap of thunder ripping through the heavens, and from Zeus's head, Athena appeared. However, in most dramatic retellings, one crucial nuance is often overlooked. Athena did not simply spring from her father's head, instantly dispensing strategic advice. For the first few moments she stood, blinking slowly in the dazzling light of Olympus, likely as astonished by her sudden appearance as all the assembled gods. Consider what it means to be born fully adult. No childhood memories, no gradual learning, just a sudden awareness of existence with a complete understanding of the world. She was clad in armor, yes, but it was neither ornate nor richly adorned. It was practical, expertly crafted protection that someone truly versed in warfare would choose. Her spear was not a ceremonial attribute. It was perfectly balanced for actual combat. And when she removed her helmet, hair already touched with the silver of wisdom was revealed, even though she was entirely new to this world. Athena's first act was to survey all the gods gazing at her. Then she turned her attention to Zeus, who was rubbing his head with palpable relief. She likely sensed the intangible but persistent presence of her mother, Métis, who was now, in some incomprehensible way, a part of herself, an awareness that would take years to fully comprehend. Well, she might have said in that calm, measured voice that would later become so familiar to heroes and petitioners throughout the ages, "This is quite interesting." Meanwhile, Zeus experienced the deepest relief of his immortal life. The agonizing headache had vanished, replaced by a strange yet all-consuming sense of pride. Before him stood his daughter, clearly intelligent, undeniably capable, and by some inner knowing, he simply knew she would never threaten his rule. Moreover, she would be his greatest ally. And he was right. Athena went down in history as Zeus's favorite daughter, the one he trusted most. She never married, never had children who might disrupt the established order. Instead, she became the goddess of wisdom, strategic warfare, and all crafts requiring both intellectual acumen and skill. But sometimes, in quiet moments between her many duties, Athena would gently touch her temple, as if remembering something she had never truly experienced. Her mother Meta's wisdom lived within her, along with all those carefully laid plans and unspoken thoughts that had been cut short so unfairly. What would it be like to come into the world possessing another's memories, with a stream of another's wisdom flowing through one's mind like a gentle brook, to carry within you the love and knowledge of a parent you never saw, yet who, in the most literal sense, became an integral part of your very being? The goddess Athena, whose birth has just been described, required temples built in her honor, and someone had to perform the painstaking work of carving and setting these monumental stones. While poets composed hymns to heroes and gods, there were other hands, weathered, skilled, filled with patience, that shaped marble and limestone destined to stand for millennia. Many have seen images of the Parthenon, that magnificent sanctuary crowning the Acropolis in Athens. Few, however, have considered the person who might have spent 3 years just carving a single-column capital, working with tools that today would seem incredibly primitive. His name might have been Carlos or Demetrius. The exact name will forever remain unknown, but his labor outlived empires. Let us call him Alexios, for every story needs a name. Imagine him waking before dawn on a cool morning in 440 BCE. In the city, sprawling beneath the Acropolis, roosters are just beginning to crow, and the olive oil lamp in his humble dwelling flickers as he gathers his tools. Alexios had dedicated himself to the art of stonemasonry for 23 years, learning this ancient craft from his father, who, in turn, had learned it from his own parent. His hands, calloused from labor, were perpetually imbued with the finest marble dust, and a small scar marked his left thumb, a reminder of the day his chisel slipped when he was still an inexperienced apprentice. He was now 42, an age that granted him enough experience to work on the most critical and delicate parts of the temple, while still retaining the necessary physical strength for heavy loads. His breakfast was simple yet nourishing: a slice of bread generously dipped in olive oil, a few olives, and water lightly diluted with wine. His wife, Penelope, with a familiar gesture, handed him a cloth-wrapped parcel containing his lunch: a bit more bread, a piece of cheese, and perhaps a handful of juicy figs if the season allowed. In the early morning hours, she spoke little. After 18 years of marriage, they had settled into a comfortable routine that required few words. The climb to the sacred hill of the Acropolis takes approximately 20 minutes, and Alexios is not a solitary traveller. He is just one link in a continuous chain of labourers who follow this same well-trodden path daily. Carpenters carry their tools. Artists are armed with brushes and palettes full of pigments. Laborers are tasked with moving massive marble blocks to their designated places throughout the day. They exchange reserved nods as they continue their ascent. These people are constructing a monument destined to outlast them all. The construction site is already bustling with activity by the time the sun rises above the eastern mountains. The chief architect, Ictinus, as always, arrived early, meticulously examining his detailed blueprints and scrupulously controlling the parameters. He is the famous architect whose name will forever be etched in the annals of history. However, Alexios knows something that history books will not record. Ictinus relies heavily on the deep, practical knowledge of skilled craftsmen like Alexios. Just yesterday, he invited Alexios to inspect a problem with one of the column drums. An unforeseen vein ran through the marble, and the architect wanted to know if it would affect the strength and integrity of the finished piece. Alexios carefully ran his palms over the stone's surface, hands that had touched countless marble fragments, hands that possessed the unique ability to read stone, much as others read ancient scrolls. "It will hold," he pronounced after a moment's thought. "The grain runs with the weight, not against it. But we want to orient this piece so the vein is on the backside, away from the main line of sight." This was knowledge honed by decades of diligent work, wisdom stemming not from parchment scrolls or mathematical calculations, but from years of intimate interaction with stone, understanding its inherent properties and hidden possibilities. Today, Alexios dedicates his day to working on a future section of the frieze that encircles the temple's interior. It is an artistic tableau depicting the solemn procession of Athenian citizens offering gifts to the goddess Athena as part of the grand Panathenaic festival. This particular fragment features a group of young men accompanying sacrificial animals, and he has been working on it for 6 weeks. The work progresses with agonizing slowness. Every chisel stroke demands extreme precision, for marble tolerates no mistakes. An overly forceful application of the tool can cause an unwanted fragment to break off. Overly cautious manipulations will take twice as long as necessary for work that could be completed more productively. Alexios begins each figure with a primary rough shaping of the basic form, using a point chisel, a reliable tool capable of removing significant volumes of stone relatively quickly. The sound it makes, a monotonous tap-tap, eventually transforms into something almost meditative, measuring the passage of time with its steady rhythm. Other stonemasons working nearby tap out their unique rhythms, and together they form a kind of percussive ensemble, echoing off the majestic marble colonnades. As the morning gains strength and the sun rises higher, Alexios turns to more delicate tools. A flat chisel allows him to smooth surfaces and create flawlessly sharp contours. Calipers serve to control proportions, the distance between a figure's eyes, the width of a bull's shoulders. The Greeks held specific, strictly defined ideas about ideal proportions, about harmonious mathematical ratios that were supposed to generate aesthetic perfection. But Alexios knows that pure mathematics alone cannot create true art. There is something else, something more elusive and difficult to define, that separates skillful but merely competent carving from a truly beautiful creation. He sees this in how his teacher, the venerable Sophron, was able to breathe life into marble. Sophron died 3 years ago, yet his works still adorn the temple everywhere, and sometimes Alexios pauses his work to carefully study a fragment skillfully carved by Sophron, striving to comprehend how the old master achieved such astonishing effects. Around midday, when the sun reaches its zenith, and the oppressive heat makes the marble almost impossible to touch comfortably, the labourers pause their work. They seek refuge in any available shade, eat a modest meal, and share water from massive clay amphorae, constantly refilled by young assistants. Conversations during these rest periods rarely touch upon art or magnificent architecture. More often they revolve around everyday life concerns. Whose wife is expecting an addition to the family? Where to buy olive oil at the best price? How serious are the circulating rumours of disagreements with Sparta to worry about? Although they are skilled craftsmen, they are also full citizens, caring husbands, loving fathers, and integral members of their community. Alexios sits next to Nicias, a painter busy decorating the temple's interior spaces. Nicias is younger, about 28, and still enthralled by every aspect of the grand project, which Alexios finds endearing but also slightly tiring. "Did you see the new batch of marble that arrived yesterday?" Nicias asks, breaking off a piece of Parthenon bread. "Its quality is truly outstanding, so flawless that in the thinnest slices it's almost translucent." Alexios nods. He saw it. Of course, excellent marble for a sculptor is akin to high-quality pigments for a painter. It is the foundation for all future creation. Parthenon marble is truly unique, possessing a crystalline structure that allows light to penetrate slightly deeper than the surface, imbuing finished sculptures with an almost luminous inner glow. It is carefully preserved for the creation of the cult statue. Alexios says that Phidias intends to use it for the face and hands of the goddess Athena. This is breathtaking news. Phidias is the most celebrated sculptor in all of Hellas, and his statue of Athena will serve as the main focal point of the entire temple complex. A significant portion of the statue will be made of gold and ivory, but the exposed skin, the face, hands, and feet will be carved from this priceless Parthenon marble. After the break, Alexios returns to work on his frieze. The afternoon's labour takes on different characteristics compared to the morning routine. The lighting has transformed, with rays now falling at a different angle, revealing previously hidden nuances of the carving. It is now that he can discern with utmost clarity how the work is progressing, where necessary adjustments need to be made. He focuses on creating the face of a young man in the procession, roughly the same age as his own son. His task is to sculpt a face that resembles a living person, someone one might well encounter on the streets of Athens, while simultaneously embodying the ideal of youthful male beauty that the Hellenes so highly revered. The eyes present a particular challenge. They must appear attentive and full of life, focused on the sacred purpose of the procession, yet not be so individualized as to distract from the overall composition. Alexios has carved hundreds of eyes over the years, and he has developed unique methods for creating the subtlest shadows and artful highlights that give marble the illusion of sight. As he works, he reflects on eternity. This temple is being built to last forever, or as close to forever as human architecture can achieve. Many centuries after Alexios leaves this world, long after everyone currently living in Athens has passed into oblivion and been forgotten, descendants will stand in this temple and gaze upon the work he is doing today. It is a thought both sobering and inspiring. The face of the young man he carves will outlive wars, political upheavals, the rise and fall of empires. In a sense, Alexios achieves a kind of immortality that no monarch or general can claim. His creation will bear witness to him for centuries. However, there is also something humbling in this. No one will know his name. No poet will compose odes in honor of Alexios the stonemason. His contribution will remain anonymous, dissolved into the greater glory of Athens and its patron goddess. And in some way this seems right to him. The temple is not an embodiment of personal glory. It is something far greater, something that inextricably links all Athenians to their deities and to each other. Alexios is an integral part of this sacred connection, just one link in a great chain stretching from the city's founding to an unimaginably distant future. As the sun begins to dip behind the western hills, casting long, winding shadows across the sacred Acropolis, Alexios carefully cleans his tools and prepares to head home. Tomorrow he will return again and resume the unhurried yet painstaking work of bringing silent stone to life. Day by day, stroke by stroke, he and his fellow masters create something magnificent that will stand for centuries as an enduring testament to human skill and unwavering dedication. One can only imagine what it must be like to dedicate one's days to creating a work known to outlive its creator by millennia. To labor in silent anonymity on a project so vast it seems to touch eternity itself. The builders of Athena's temples, skilled craftsmen all, were quite hungry by midday, and their humble lunch invariably included the same precious golden ingredient into which Alexios dipped his morning bread. Olive oil in ancient Athens was not merely a foodstuff. It was the very lifeblood that permeated the city's economy, culture, and daily rituals, much like blood flowing through veins. Imagine Theodorus, an olive oil merchant who owns 3 extensive groves on the picturesque slopes outside Athens. He awoke before the first rays of dawn, not out of excessive ambition, but because his meticulous work demanded it. Olive oil is a delicate product, extremely sensitive to heat, light, and time, and it is these factors that can determine the line between prosperity and destitution. The olive trees growing on Theodorus's land are of considerable age. Some were planted by his great-grandfather's grandfather. These ancient trees are characterized by thick, gnarled trunks and silvery green foliage that whispers softly with the slightest breeze. They do not reach great heights, as is typical for olive trees, yet they are exceptionally sturdy, as if designed to withstand the scorching, dry summers and mild winters of Attica. Each tree possesses its own unique character, if one has the skill to discern it. An ancient tree standing by the old stone wall invariably bears fruit that ripens a week earlier than the rest. The grove located on the eastern slope yields oil with a subtle peppery hint, particularly prized and ordered by certain discerning customers. Trees growing by the stream produce a more abundant harvest, but their fruit has a milder flavor, ideal for everyday cooking, though not as highly valued for special occasions when olive oil is used in sacred religious ceremonies. Early in the morning, Theodorus carefully supervised the harvest. It was late October, and the olives had reached near perfect ripeness. They had acquired a deep purple, almost black hue, and their flesh was yielding to a gentle squeeze, yet they did not fall from the branches at the slightest touch. In olive oil production, timing was crucial. Harvesting too early risked a smaller volume of oil with a sharp and bitter taste. If delayed, the olives would begin to ferment directly on the tree, completely distorting the flavor of the finished product. His workers, a diverse group from slaves to hired free citizens and neighbors helping in exchange for a share of the oil harvest, had been toiling in the fields for 3 days. They skillfully used long poles. to gently knock the olives from the branches, allowing them to fall onto large sheets of cloth, carefully spread beneath each tree. This was truly painstaking work, requiring extreme caution. Too strong a blow could damage the buds destined for next year's harvest, while too gentle a touch would not dislodge the ripe fruit. Observing this process, one might be surprised by the abundance of conversation that accompanied the harvest. Olive picking was not a solitary activity. It required clear coordination between the person with the pole and those holding the cloth, and the natural rhythm of the work itself created a favorable environment for lively chatter. The workers discussed everything, from local politics and the latest gossip from the agora to predictions about the weather and complaints about various aches and ailments. Among the labourers, an elderly man named Cleon stood out, having assisted Theodorus with the harvest for 15 years. He knew these trees almost as well as their owner, and held strong opinions on every matter related to olive cultivation. "This new variety they're planting in Aegina," he said, shaking his head disapprovingly as he positioned a ladder against another tree. "Too much oil, but utterly tasteless. Quantity isn't everything." Theodorus nodded absently. He had heard this sentiment many times before, and while he couldn't entirely disagree, he also understood the economic pressures that drove agricultural innovation. Athens was growing rapidly, and the demand for olive oil seemed to increase with each passing year. At times, quantity truly did matter, especially when the task was to feed an entire city. By mid-morning, the workers had filled several large baskets with fresh olives, and it was time to transport them to the olive press. It was here that the olive oil production process became truly fascinating. Most people, however, rarely considered the complex and multi-stage process that transformed bitter, inedible olives into the golden oil that graced their dinner tables. The olive press was an imposing structure, a massive stone wheel that was rolled over the olives to crush them into a thick paste. This wheel was powered by a mule, which walked steadily in circles for hours, with periodic breaks for water and rest. The work was devoid of glamour, but it demanded constant attention and precision. The olives had to be ground thoroughly, but not so aggressively as to crack the pits, which could impart an undesirable bitterness to the oil. Once the olives were meticulously crushed, the resulting paste was spread onto circular mats woven from strong plant fibers. These mats were then carefully stacked and placed beneath a massive wooden beam, which functioned as a lever press. Heavy weights were added to one end of the beam, creating colossal pressure that gradually squeezed the oil from the olive paste. The first oil to emerge from the press was considered the most valuable. It was clear, golden, with an extraordinarily fresh, fruity aroma that seemed to speak of sunshine and careful cultivation. This first pressing, which in the modern world would be called extra virgin olive oil, commanded the highest prices in the agora. Wealthy Athenians used it for exquisite dishes, and it was absolutely indispensable for religious ceremonies, where the purity of the product was paramount. But the process did not end there. After the first pressing, the mats were repositioned and pressed again, yielding a second-grade oil, still good enough for most culinary purposes. Even after that, the remaining paste could be mixed with hot water and pressed one more time, extracting a lower-grade oil suitable for lamps and other non-culinary needs. Theodorus took pride in the fact that nothing was wasted in his production. The leftover pulp and crushed pits made excellent fertilizer for the next year's crop. The water used in the final pressing, though not potable, could be used to irrigate the olive trees during dry spells. Even the mats, when they finally wore out, were composted and returned to the soil. On this day, Theodorus was preparing to load amphorae, these distinctive clay vessels with narrow necks and pointed bottoms, with his finest oil and transport them to Athens for sale. The amphorae themselves were true works of art, crafted by skilled potters who understood perfectly that the container was almost as important as its contents. A well-made amphora reliably protected the oil from light and air, preserving its freshness for many months or even years. The journey to the city took about 2 hours by ox-drawn cart, along a road that had been polished by generations of similar trips. Theodorus knew every stone and every rut on this path, every spot where the cart might get stuck in wet weather, and every vista that offered picturesque panoramas of the city and its surroundings. As he neared Athens, the traffic grew increasingly busy. Other farmers also brought their produce to market: wheat, barley, wine, honey, cheese, vegetables. The city depended on this daily influx of food from the surrounding lands, and the farmers, in turn, depended on the city's demand for their goods. It was a relationship that worked because both sides needed what the other offered. Theodorus's regular spot in the agora was near the southwest corner, where he had been selling oil for 12 years. His regular customers knew where to find him, and he knew their preferences well. Aristophanes, the cook, always ordered the peppery oil from the eastern slope grove. The priestess of Demeter insisted on oil from the oldest trees, claiming she could taste the difference in ritual preparations. But today he had a new client, a young woman who seemed a bit unsure of what she needed. Perhaps she was recently married and still learning to manage a household. Theodorus patiently explained the different grades of oil, offering small samples directly from his fingertip. For cooking fish, he said, you'll want something with a bit of a bite, something that won't get lost against stronger flavors. But for bread, or dressing vegetables, you might prefer something milder, more subtle. This kind of education was an integral part of his work, and he genuinely enjoyed it. There was deep satisfaction in helping another person understand what he knew so well, in sharing knowledge passed down through generations of olive growers and oil producers. By the end of the day, most of his amphorae were empty, sold to customers who carried the oil home in smaller containers. The money he earned was destined to pay for what his farm could not produce: salt, iron, tools, pottery, cloth. It also provided a small surplus that allowed him to gradually improve his groves, planting new trees to replace those that eventually grew too old to yield a good harvest. As he loaded the empty vessels back onto the cart for the journey home, Theodorus mused on the strange miracle of his existence. These ancient trees, planted by ancestors he never knew, continued to provide sustenance for families he might never meet. The oil flowing from his presses would light lamps in homes throughout Athens, nourish yet unborn children, anoint athletes preparing for contests, and serve as offerings in temples dedicated to gods whose stories stretched back into the deepest antiquity. There was something profoundly satisfying in participating in this ancient cycle, planting, tending, harvesting, processing, selling, and then beginning again. The olive trees would outlive him, as they had outlived his father and grandfather. The knowledge of how to transform bitter fruit into golden oil would pass to his sons and their sons after them. It seemed that working with something so deeply rooted in the earth and in human tradition, where daily labor connected one to thousands of years of accumulated wisdom, carried a special significance. The very olive oil Theodorus had just sold would eventually find its way to many tables across Athens, including the one where Philippus, a hoplite in the Athenian army, shared his evening meal with his family. But right now, as dawn broke over the mountains, Philippus was 40 miles from home, carrying 60 pounds of gear and wondering if his feet would ever stop hurting. Being a hoplite sounded quite glamorous when poets sang about it. Brave warriors standing shoulder to shoulder, bronze armor gleaming in the sun, fighting for the glory of Athens. The reality, however, was quite different. Most of a hoplite's time was spent marching, and Philippus had done plenty of that lately. His unit had left Athens 6 days ago, responding to reports of raiders threatening one of the city's allied settlements. As it turned out, it was a false alarm. The raiders were merely a group of shepherds who had wandered further from home than usual following their flocks. But orders were orders, and the army didn't turn back just because the threat was imaginary. They continued toward a border fort where they were to spend 2 weeks helping repair fortifications and training the local militia. Philippus was 31, placing him among the middle-aged warriors in his unit. He had served valiantly as a hoplite for 13 years. From the moment he inherited enough land to afford the necessary equipment, military service in Athens became not just a sacred duty, but an honorable privilege. Only citizens wealthy enough to purchase their own armor and weapons were eligible to serve in the heavy infantry. His panoply, the full hoplite kit, represented a significant investment. A bronze cuirass alone cost more than a skilled craftsman could earn in 3 months of hard labor. The round shield, or hoplon, which gave the hoplites their name, was expertly crafted from wood overlaid with bronze, featuring a distinctive rim that could be used as a formidable weapon in close combat. His 9-foot spear was perfectly balanced for precise thrusting, not for throwing. A short sword served as a backup weapon, and a bronze helmet with a characteristic crest completed this imposing ensemble. All this gear was either strapped to Philippus's body or slung over his shoulders as he steadily marched along the dusty road. The weight was, of course, distributed as evenly as possible, but after 6 days of continuous marching, every strap found a way to chafe his skin, and every piece of metal seemed to develop its own particular method of digging into his flesh. The morning still offered coolness, which was a true blessing. By midday, when the sun reached its zenith, the bronze armor would become almost unbearably hot. Philippus had long since learned to drink water regularly throughout the day, even when not particularly thirsty, for dehydration in armor could prove deadly. He walked side by side with Nicodemus, a potter who served in the same unit. For years they had participated in various campaigns together, and a light, easy conversation had developed between them, helping to pass the long hours of the journey. "My wife," Nicodemus said, adjusting his shield strap for the 100th time that morning, "thinks I should request a city garrison assignment. It would be easier for the family," she keeps saying. "A more predictable schedule." Philippus thoughtfully considered these words. Garrison duty certainly had its advantages. Most nights you could sleep in your own bed. There was an opportunity to attend to personal affairs. Children grew up knowing their father. However, it also tended to be incredibly dull. Standing guard at the city gates, escorting officials to meetings, maintaining equipment that was rarely used in actual combat. "The pay is about the same," Philippus remarked, "but you miss out on your share of any spoils we might capture." This was a crucial consideration for citizen soldiers who were not particularly wealthy. Military service was compensated, but not generously, and the prospect of additional income from successful campaigns could significantly impact a family's economic standing. The column of marching hoplites stretched for almost a quarter of a mile along the road. Approximately 400 men participated in this expedition, organized into units by tribes and demes. Philippus belonged to the Antiochus tribe, and within it he was part of a group from his local deme of Acharnae. These were people he had known most of his life, neighbors, relatives, those he regularly encountered in the agora or during religious festivals. This familiarity was both a strength and a source of complexity. On one hand, hoplite warfare depended entirely on mutual trust and impeccable coordination. When a warrior stood in the phalanx, his life literally depended on whether the man next to him would hold his position and do his job. It was reassuring to know that the man holding the shield protecting your right side was someone you had grown up with, whose nature you understood. On the other hand, personal relationships could significantly complicate military discipline. The man walking ahead of Philippus was his cousin Demetrius, who had a habit of complaining loudly about everything, from the quality of their rations to the competence of their officers. In civilian life, this was just part of Demetrius's character, tolerated by his family with good-natured eye rolls. In military situations, however, it could be genuinely disruptive to morale. Around mid-morning, the column reached a small stream where they were allowed a short break. The men shed their heavy packs and immediately headed for the water, not only to drink, but also to splash their hot faces and necks. Some of the younger soldiers fully removed their bronze breastplates, but veterans like Philippus knew that the effort of getting back into armor wasn't worth the temporary relief. Instead, he found a shady spot under an olive tree and carefully sat down, mindful of the sword at his hip and the spear he leaned against the trunk. From his pack, he pulled out a piece of hard bread and some dried figs, standard campaign rations, nourishing if not particularly exciting. As he ate, Philippus watched the young men splashing in the stream and recalled his first campaign 15 years ago. He had been so eager to prove himself, so convinced that military service would be all glory and heroism, that the reality of aching feet, heavy gear, and endless walking had come as a significant shock. But over the years, he had developed a different attitude toward military service. There was something to be said for the straightforward nature of army life. You knew what was expected of you. Your duties were clearly defined. Success and failure were usually obvious. In his civilian life, Philippus worked the land his father had left him, growing olives and barley and keeping a few goats. It was good, honest work, but it was also full of uncertainties. Weather, crop diseases, fluctuating market prices, the need to maintain good relations with neighbors who might help in emergencies. All these factors could affect his family's well-being in ways largely beyond his control. Military service, by contrast, simplified his life. Follow orders, maintain your gear, look out for your fellow soldiers, do your duty when called to fight. There was something almost comforting in that clarity. The period of rest ended too soon, as it always did, and the column reformed to continue the march. The road ahead gradually ascended into hills overgrown with scrub oak and wild grasses. The landscape was beautiful in its own way, rocky, sun-baked, dotted with small farms and shepherds' huts, but Philippus had learned to view it primarily from a tactical perspective. This ridge would provide good cover for archers. The narrow pass ahead could be easily blocked by a small detachment, trapping a larger army in the valley below. The flat area near this village would be suitable for forming a phalanx. but the rocky ground to the east would favour lighter, more mobile troops. This way of perceiving the landscape gradually developed in experienced soldiers. Everything became a potential battlefield, every natural feature a possible advantage or obstacle. It was not an especially peaceful way to see the world, but it was practical knowledge that had saved Philippus's life in several real battles. By the end of the day, the fort they were heading for became visible in the distance, a modest cluster of stone buildings surrounded by walls that had undoubtedly seen better days. It was these very fortifications they were to spend the next 2 weeks repairing, as well as training the local militia in basic tactics and formations. This was not glamorous work, but it was of immense importance. The network of small forts and allied settlements surrounding Athens was part of what ensured the city's safety and prosperity. Each outpost slightly extended Athenian influence, served as a base for patrols that kept trade routes secure, and offered refuge to farmers and shepherds when raiders appeared. As they approached the fort, Philippus saw people coming out to meet them. The garrison commander, local officials, children who were excited by the arrival of real Athenian soldiers. There would be a brief ceremony, a few speeches about duty and service to the city, and then the practical work of setting up camp and beginning their assigned tasks. Tonight he would sleep on the ground under the stars, wrapped in his cloak and using his shield as a pillow. It was uncomfortable but familiar, and there was something to be said for the simple pleasure of finally shedding his armour and resting his feet. Tomorrow he would wake with new aches and begin the work of strengthening this small outpost of Athenian power. It was not the stuff of epic poetry, but it was the kind of constant, unglamorous effort that actually kept a city-state functioning and secure. Can you imagine what it is like to carry such a burden, both literally and figuratively? The physical weight of armour and weapons, and the responsibility of protecting not only your family but the entire community that depends on your service. While Philippus and his fellow soldiers marched to their border fort, pilgrims from across the Greek world were undertaking their own journey to a far more famous and mysterious place, Delphi, where the oracle spoke the very words of Apollo. But beyond the dramatic prophecies and sacred rituals lay a quieter story of daily life in the shadow of the gods. Meet the Pythia, not by her given name, which was likely something common like Cleone or Theodora, but by the title she assumed when she became the voice of the oracle. She was 43 years old, had served as the Pythia for 11 years, and right now she sat in her small room within the temple complex, preparing for what might be the most significant consultation of her career. Tomorrow, ambassadors from Athens were due to arrive with questions about a proposed military campaign. The day after, a delegation from Sparta wanted guidance on a contentious succession. The following week, a wealthy merchant from Corinth would come to ask if Apollo approved of his plan to establish a new trading colony. The questions never ceased, and each carried the weight of decisions that could impact thousands of lives. But tonight, in the quiet hour before dawn, the Pythia was simply a middle-aged woman with greying hair and tired eyes, preparing herself mentally and spiritually for another day of being the voice of a god. Her daily routine, steeped in sacred duties, began with meticulously observed purification rituals, unseen by most visitors to Delphi. The first step was a cleansing in the waters of the sacred Castalian spring, whose icy cold, even in the height of summer, would make her gasp and feel a slight numbness. This sharp, penetrating chill was an essential part of the preparation, serving as a catalyst. It cleared her mind, cutting away worldly thoughts, and fully grounded her in her own body, preparing her to receive any divine inspiration that might be granted. After this ritual bath, she would don a simple white chiton, a symbol of her sacred office. She wore no jewelry, no adornments of any kind. Nothing was to distract from her role as a pure and unblemished conduit for the wisdom emanating from Apollo himself. The Pythia's breakfast was equally spare: bread, water, sometimes a few almonds. She had long learned that prophetic revelations came more easily on a nearly empty stomach, demanding minimal digestive effort from the body. The oracle's sanctuary itself was a space unlike any other on earth. Built over a natural fissure in the rock, it was perpetually permeated by the scent of laurel leaves, mingled with a faint, sweetish odor of gases rising from deep underground layers. Modern scholars propose various hypotheses regarding the nature of these vapors, perhaps ethylene or other natural compounds capable of inducing altered states of consciousness. For the Pythia, however, such a chemical explanation was alien. She perceived the strange sensations that enveloped her in this chamber solely as the undeniable presence of the divine. Meanwhile, her faithful assistant, Nicomachus, already awaited her arrival in the temple. This priest, having dedicated 23 years of his life to Delphi, served as a vital link and interpreter between the oracle and the outside world. The Pythia uttered words granted to her by Apollo, but these words were not always easily comprehensible to ordinary mortals. Sometimes her speech came in verse, at times she spoke in riddles, and occasionally in languages she consciously did not know. Nicomachus, over the years, had developed an outstanding skill in transforming these divine revelations into concrete and applicable advice. This was truly delicate and responsible work. He had to remain absolutely faithful to the oracle's words while simultaneously making them accessible and understandable to people who had travelled hundreds of miles and spent significant sums for the honour of consulting Apollo. The Athenian delegation arrived late last night, Nicomachus informed her, as they walked unhurriedly through the temple corridors. 3 generals and a representative from the assembly. Their question concerns the proposed expedition to Sicily. The Pythia merely nodded in response, for she had already foreseen this important consultation. The idea of the Sicilian expedition stirred the minds of the entire Hellenic world. It was an ambitious and risky plan, capable of bringing Athens either unprecedented glory and fabulous wealth, or complete and utter ruin. Mortal rulers preferred not to make such decisions, fraught with colossal consequences, without direct divine guidance. The consultation chamber was already meticulously prepared for their arrival. In the centre, directly above the fissure in the rock, stood the sacred tripod, a 3-legged bronze seat. Laurel branches, dedicated to Apollo, were arranged throughout the room, and in a bronze brazier an eternal flame burned steadily and unceasingly, maintained for centuries. The Pythia took her seat on the tripod and closed her eyes, allowing her breathing to slow and deepen. This was the most intimate and mysterious part of her service, the moment when she had to somehow open herself up to become a pure vessel for divine communication. In 11 years of practice, she had developed certain methods that aided her in this, but the process was never exactly the same. Sometimes the inspiration came as words that seemed to form in her mind without any conscious effort. At times they were more like images or powerful emotions that she then needed to translate into understandable words. And sometimes, more often than she cared to admit, nothing happened at all, and she would have to sit in silence, patiently waiting for Apollo to deign to speak, or until it became clear that this day would yield no prophecy. The Athenian delegation was led by Nicias, a general whom the Pythia remembered well from their previous visits. He was an exceedingly cautious man, deeply religious, rarely making any significant decisions without prior divine guidance. His questions were always thoughtful, and he listened with unwavering respect to every answer received. Today, however, there was something different in his demeanor. A palpable tension was present, as if he already sensed and feared what the oracle might portend. When Nicomachus formally presented the question about the Sicilian expedition, the Pythia sensed that Nicias, in fact, desperately hoped for an unequivocally negative answer. He needed permission to abandon a plan he considered excessively dangerous. The inspiration, when it came, was unusually clear and instantaneous. The words formed themselves in the Pythia's mind, and she spoke them aloud, not yet fully grasping their profound meaning. The expedition will bring great change to Athens. Many will set sail but not return. The gods favor those who act justly, but justice and victory are not always the same. This was precisely the type of answer that seekers of oracles both valued and resented. It clearly addressed their question, yet remained open to multiple interpretations. Did it mean the gods approved of the expedition, or was it a warning against it? The ambiguity was certainly frustrating, but it also reflected a harsh truth. The future is rarely as crystal clear as people wish it to be. Nicomachus meticulously recorded every word of the oracle, and the Athenian delegation withdrew to begin discussing its meaning. This aspect of consulting the oracle often went unappreciated by visitors. Interpreting the prophecy could be just as, if not more, important than the prophecy itself. In between consultations, the Pythia found solace in a secluded garden located behind the temple complex. It was a truly peaceful place, shaded by ancient olive trees and filled with the melodic hum of bees diligently working among the lush lavender and fragrant rosemary. These moments of quiet and solitude were absolutely essential for maintaining her mental balance in a job that required her to be constantly open and accessible to the divine. She had been the Pythia long enough to witness firsthand the far-reaching consequences of some of her prophecies. Entire cities started or stopped wars based on her words. People made life-altering decisions thanks to guidance received in the sacred oracle chamber. The burden of this colossal responsibility was at times truly overwhelming. However, there were also moments of genuine wonder, when she distinctly felt connected to something immeasurably greater than her own being. Not every prophecy was accompanied by dramatic inspiration. Many consultations concerned simple requests for guidance in daily affairs, and the answers that came through her often proved surprisingly practical and helpful. A farmer sought to know the best time to sow his crops. A woman inquired whether she should accept a marriage proposal. A merchant asked about the safest route for his trading journey. These were not the consultations that changed the course of history, but it was precisely these that reminded the Pythia that her ultimate role was to help people live more wisely and consciously. As the day inexorably moved towards evening, the Pythia continued to receive visitors who had arrived from Thebes, Corinth, and even a small city-state located in southern Italy. Each consultation followed the unchanging, centuries-old pattern: a formal statement of the question, a period of inspired response, the meticulous recording of her words, and then a discussion of their meaning and possible interpretations. Yet behind this strict ritualistic structure, a profound human drama always unfolded. Before her stood people facing genuine uncertainty, desperately seeking guidance in situations where the stakes were often extraordinarily high. The Pythia had, over time, learned to hear not only their official questions, but also the deep-seated fears and unspoken hopes that resided in their hearts. For instance, a young man from Corinth might inquire about the prospects of his business venture, but his true concern lay in whether he was worthy of his father's respect. An elderly woman from Thebes might ask about her grandson's education, yet what she truly desired to know was whether her lineage would prosper after her passing. By evening, when the last consultation was complete and the temple complex fell silent, the Pythia felt an exhaustion that had nothing to do with physical fatigue. Speaking on behalf of a god, even for just a few hours a day, demanded a colossal emotional and spiritual energy that was difficult to describe to those who had never experienced it. She ate a simple meal in her chambers alone: bread, cheese, olives, water mixed with a small amount of wine. The food seemed especially delicious after a day of fasting and intense spiritual effort. During her meal, she could hear the distant murmur of pilgrims gathered around their campfires, discussing the guidance they had received and making plans for their journey home. Tomorrow, new questions would come, new seekers of truth, new opportunities to serve as a bridge between the human and divine realms. The work would continue, as it had for centuries, as long as people needed guidance and Apollo chose to provide it through mortal voices. Reflecting on her service, one can only imagine the weight of the daily labor involved in translating divine whispers into words comprehensible to ordinary people. Upon her shoulders rested the colossal responsibility for critical decisions made by others. The very pilgrims now gathered around their campfires in Delphi would wake up hungry tomorrow morning, and their humble breakfast would be a direct result of the labor of people like Dionysius. This farmer tilled his fields in the fertile Thessalian plain, away from the famous temples and bustling agoras that typically capture our attention when we think of ancient Greece. Dionysius grew wheat and barley on land his family had farmed for 6 generations, passing down knowledge and skills from father to son. He was 54 and his hands were permanently darkened from constant contact with the soil and the scorching sun. He possessed invaluable knowledge of weather patterns and soil conditions, knowledge that could not be gleaned from any book. Now, on this cool early spring morning, he slowly walked through his fields with the focused attention characteristic of a man whose survival and the well-being of his family depended directly on making absolutely correct decisions: when to plant, how much to plant, and precisely where to place the crops. The current winter had been unusually mild, which might seem like good news for agriculture. However, Dionysius, seasoned by years of working the land, had long learned to approach hasty conclusions with the utmost caution. A warm winter could promise an early spring, which certainly sounded positive, but it also carried a hidden danger: the survival of certain harmful organisms that usually perished in harsh frosts. Moreover, premature planting, while potentially increasing the future harvest, significantly raised the risk of damage to young sprouts if late frosts unexpectedly returned after the seeds had already germinated. Stopping at the edge of his largest field, he instinctively knelt and scooped up a handful of earth. This movement was almost an unconscious ritual. His fingers habitually explored the soil, searching for that precise balance of moisture and structure that signaled optimal conditions for sowing. Excessive moisture threatened to rot the seeds before they sprouted, while excessive dryness would deny them any chance of germination at all. Today's soil seemed merely adequate, certainly not ideal. Ideal land, as he well knew, was more the stuff of hopes and dreams than reality, but this current soil was perfectly suitable for the laborious work that lay ahead. Straightening up, Dionysius called out to his son, Callisthenes, who was at the far end of the field, setting up the plough harnessed to a pair of powerful oxen. 22-year-old Callisthenes, hardened by years of tireless work on the family farm, was strong and determined to take on more responsibility for managing the household. However, his youth also allowed him to sometimes question established working methods, which often led to lively discussions during the long hours they spent together. "Father," Callisthenes began, guiding the plough into its starting position, "I spoke with Aristodemus yesterday. He's going to try a new planting method we heard about from the Egyptians. It involves closer seed spacing and more intensive cultivation. Aristodemus believes this approach could increase yields by up to 20%. Dionysius listened carefully, pondering what he heard, and meanwhile checked the bronze ploughshare, ensuring it was properly sharpened and securely fastened. He himself was aware of Egyptian agricultural techniques, and theoretically, they did sound quite promising. But as he well knew, theory and practice were often entirely different matters, especially when it came to such an unpredictable and fickle occupation as farming. "Aristodemus," he finally said, "has excellent land, rich soil, stable water flow, and abundant human resources to perform the extra work that intensive cultivation demands. Our situation is significantly different." This was part of the invaluable experience that every farmer must pass on to the next generation. It was not just about the practical skills of growing crops, but also about a deep understanding of what would or would not be effective in their specific conditions. Each farm is unique, shaped by an inimitable blend of soil characteristics, climate, water availability, labor, and market realities. They began ploughing, following the already established furrows that stretched across the field. This work had a rhythmic, almost meditative calm once one settled into its steady pace. The ox, knowing its task well, required little intervention. Callisthenes walked alongside the animal, occasionally guiding its movement slightly to ensure the furrows remained perfectly straight. Dionysius followed his son, using a short-handled hoe to break up large clods of earth and level the bottom of the trench. As he worked, Dionysius kept a watchful eye on the sky, as is customary for a man whose fate is inextricably linked to the whims of the heavens. The high-flying, sparse clouds today did not portend rain, which was favorable for ploughing, but it also meant carefully monitoring soil moisture levels over the next few days. Too many clear days in a row, and the ground could become too compacted for further planting. The steady rhythm of work, as often happens, created natural pauses for conversation, and father and son discussed a wide range of topics as they moved steadily across the field. Family news was on the agenda. Callisthenes' younger sister was getting married next month, which required careful preparation. Local politics were also touched upon. The city assembly was considering a new levy on grain exports, which could significantly affect their income. Technical farming questions were also not overlooked, whether to increase the acreage dedicated to wheat or instead favor barley. Each of these conversations reflected the intricate interweaving of connections and factors that define a farmer's existence. The upcoming marriage required meticulous planning, as the harvest season was approaching, and they would need all available hands during those critically important weeks. The tax discussion was significant because Dionysius regularly sold a portion of his harvested grain to merchants who then exported it to other cities. The dilemma between wheat and barley implied a complex balance between market conditions, soil quality, water availability, and the family's economic priorities. By midday, they had ploughed roughly half of the extensive field. This was a significant achievement, but much work still lay ahead. They took a short rest under the shade of an old oak tree at the edge of the field, sharing a modest meal of bread, cheese, and water from a clay jug that Callisthenes' mother had thoughtfully packed for them that morning. As they ate, Dionysius drew his son's attention to the characteristic landmarks and unique features of their land, which spoke of years of painstaking cultivation. See that low hill over there? The drainage in that section is significantly more effective. That's why we always plant our early ripening wheat varieties there. And that hollow by the stream? It retains moisture for a longer period, making it optimal for growing barley. This intimate knowledge of the land accumulates over decades. Every gentle slope, every drainage channel, every change in soil composition represents invaluable information that dictates planting decisions. A true farmer learns the art of reading his land, just as a scholar comprehends the wisdom of ancient scrolls, discerning hidden patterns and potential opportunities invisible to the uninitiated. Afternoon brought a change in weather conditions. Clouds gathered from the west, promising probable rain later in the evening. This presented a difficult dilemma. Rain would undoubtedly benefit the soil, softening its structure and simplifying further cultivation. However, it would also delay planting, and the schedule was already extremely tight for timely spring sowing. Dionysius, weighing all the pros and cons, decided to complete the ploughing of this field today, even if it meant working a little longer than usual. Farmers make such decisions countless times during each season, constantly balancing numerous variables, striving for the best outcomes, and simultaneously recognizing that a significant portion of what happens lies beyond their control. As they resumed their labor, Callisthenes voiced a question that young men have probably asked their farmer parents for millennia. Do you think I should stay in agriculture, or would it be better to try my hand at something else? Perhaps go into the city, learn a trade. It was a perfectly valid question. Farming represented exhausting labor with very uncertain rewards. The urban environment, by contrast, beckoned with other prospects. The opportunity for specialization in various crafts, thriving commerce, participation in political life, and access to cultural amenities. Moreover, there was no guarantee that the family farm would be able to sustain the next generation at the same level of prosperity that Dionysius had managed to maintain. However, there were also compelling arguments in favor of the farming way of life. These included the deep satisfaction of producing food that nourished people, an unbreakable connection to Mother Earth, the rhythms of the seasons, and natural cycles, and also the independence that came from being able to produce the vast majority of what was needed for the family's survival. The city needs what we grow here, Dionysius said after a minute's pause, and we, in turn, need what the city produces: tools, pottery, cloth, bronze. Neither way of life makes true sense without the other. This was not a direct answer to Callisthenes' question, but it offered a perspective worthy of serious consideration. The relationship between rural and urban life was not competitive. It was complementary. The grain Dionysius grew would feed the craftsmen who forged the tools he used. The taxes he paid would help support the warriors who protected his lands. The surplus produce he sold would be spent on acquiring goods that could make his family's life more comfortable. By evening, the field was entirely ploughed and fully prepared for planting. Tomorrow, weather permitting, they would begin the laborious process of sowing seeds, steadily walking up and down the furrows, scattering grain by hand at a measured pace, aimed at maximizing both germination and final yield. As they cleaned and put away their tools, Dionysius reflected on another productive day of preparing for the next year's harvest. A farmer's work, he knew well, is never-ending. There is always something that needs close attention, some aspect of agricultural operations that can be improved, some new challenge that requires a solution. But in this primordial partnership of human perseverance and natural bounty, there was also true satisfaction. The wheat and barley that would grow in this field would become daily bread in cities across the Greek world. They would sustain families, communities, and support a complex civilization that gave the world art, philosophy, and dramatic creativity. All this begins here, with the soil and the seeds and the patient labor of those who know how to draw sustenance from the earth. What do you think it is like to spend your days dedicated to a task so fundamental, one upon whose success the fate of entire civilizations depends, yet so unassuming that history rarely deigns to mention its name? The grain that Dionysius cultivated in his fields would eventually travel beyond Hellas, on ships propelled by the efforts of men like Lysander, who had served as an Athenian fleet rower for the past 4 years. Right now, with the first light of a calm Aegean morning, he was one of 170 rowers seated on wooden benches aboard a trireme, awaiting the signal to begin another day of grueling training exercises. Lysander was 26 years old, and hailed from a humble fishing village on the Attic coast. He joined naval service not from a fervent call to adventure, or a thirst for grand glory, but because the occupation offered more decent remuneration than fishing, and opened up career prospects unavailable in his native village. Fleet life proved more engaging than he had anticipated, though incomparably more demanding. The ship Lysander serves on, the Salaminia, is a true embodiment of engineering genius and shipbuilding art. It measures 120 feet in length and was designed with a priority on speed and exceptional maneuverability, rather than the capacity to carry significant cargo. The vessel's sleek and narrow hull is crafted to efficiently cut through the water thanks to the synchronized efforts of all its numerous oars. Above the rowing decks are stations for marines and officers, where their weapons and equipment are stored. However, the true heart of the ship beats in the rowing compartment, precisely where men like Lysander generate the vital power that makes everything else possible. Lysander's position is on the middle level of rowers. It is not the most prestigious assignment, but neither is it the most burdensome. Upper-level rowers, called thranites, receive slightly higher pay because their oars are longer and require more skill to manage. Lower-level rowers, known as thalamites, must work in more cramped conditions and constantly contend with incidental splashes of seawater as the ship moves swiftly. Lysander's oar is about 13 feet long, its blade carefully shaped and balanced for maximum efficiency. After 4 years of daily training, he knows precisely how it should feel in his hands. The weight distribution, the resistance as it dips into the water, the subtle vibrations that signal its perfect synchronization with the other rowers. Next to him sits Proclus, a veteran of 7 years of naval service, who has become a sort of mentor to the younger rowers. Proclus had participated in actual battles against Spartan ships during border conflicts, and his stories provide the rest of the crew with the most vivid understanding of what naval warfare truly entails. What people don't understand about sea combat, Proclus remarked yesterday during a break, is how much it depends on rowing. All the weapons in the world won't help you if you can't maneuver your ship into the right position, and positioning is entirely up to us. This is what Lysander had gradually come to realize during his time in the Navy. From the outside, a trireme might look like a warship incidentally propelled by oars. But from the inside, it's more accurately viewed as a high-precision rowing machine that happens to carry weapons. All other elements, the bronze ram at the bow, the marines with their spears and shields, the tactical skill of the officers, only become significant if the rowers can put the ship exactly where it needs to be, at precisely the right moment. Today's exercise involves practicing the complex maneuvers that make naval warfare so demanding. The crew will work on the dike plows, a technique where the ship aims to break through the enemy line and ram it from the side. They will practice the periplus, a flanking maneuver requiring perfect coordination among multiple ships. And of course they will drill on the basic but crucial skill of rapidly reversing to avoid enemy ramming attacks. The Keleustes, the rowing master who set the pace and gave commands, signalled the start. Oars! His cry rang out, and 170 blades simultaneously cut into the water. The sound was distinct, and one never truly got used to it. The splash of the blades entering the water, the creak of the oar handles against their leather thole pins, the rhythmic groan of the rower's effort. Ready, pull, and they began to move. The ship smoothly picked up speed as all these individual efforts coalesced into a single forward motion. Lysander felt the familiar burn in his shoulders and back as he settled into the rhythm. Rowing a trireme was not the same as rowing a small boat. The resistance was immense, and maintaining combat speed demanded constant effort from every man aboard. But there was also something deeply satisfying in the work. When everything went well, when all the rowers were perfectly synchronized, the ship seemed to glide through the water with an almost supernatural grace. One could feel the hull lift slightly as it gained speed, cutting through the waves with minimal resistance. In such moments, Lysander understood why some men spent their entire careers in the Navy. The first morning exercise involved practicing rapid stops and starts. Such sudden changes in motion can mean the difference between victory and defeat in actual combat. Oars! The Keleustes shouted, and immediately all the rowers lifted their blades from the water and held them horizontally. The ship continued to glide forward, but without the propulsion of the oars, it began to slow. Back! Came the next command, and now all the oars re-entered the water, but pulling in the opposite direction. This was one of the most physically grueling things a trireme crew could do. They were not only working against the ship's forward momentum, but also fighting the natural resistance of the water. Lysander gritted his teeth and pulled with all his might, feeling the ship shudder as it fought its own movement. Within seconds the Salaminia came to a complete stop. A few more seconds, and it was actually moving backward. It was an impressive demonstration of what human strength, when properly organized and directed, could achieve. Between exercises, during short breaks, the rowers conversed quietly among themselves. The conversations were a mix of technical discussions, personal news, and speculation about where their next assignment might take them. Someone had heard a rumor that they would be escorting a grain convoy from Egypt. Another believed they would participate in a show of force in the waters near Corinth. Lysander found these conversations surprisingly calming. These men had come from all over Attica and beyond, fishermen, farmers, craftsmen, labourers, but naval service had forged a common bond between them. They shared the same daily routines, the same physical challenges, the same pride in mastering a complex and important skill. The diversity of backgrounds actually strengthened the crew in subtle ways. Proclus knew about weather conditions from his years of fishing. Darren, who sat 2 benches ahead, had worked as a carpenter before joining the Navy and possessed valuable knowledge about wood and its maintenance. Hippus grew up on a farm and had the stamina that comes from years of heavy agricultural labour. Around midday, they practiced the most complex manoeuvre in their repertoire, a coordinated attack involving 3 ships working together. The Salaminia and 2 other triremes would approach an imaginary enemy vessel from different directions, forcing it to choose which threat to respond to, leaving it vulnerable to attack from other angles. Such tactical coordination required not only skill from individual crews, but also communication and synchronicity between ships. Flag signals, trumpet calls, and precise execution of predetermined movements. Everything had to work perfectly. When everything went right, it resembled a meticulously choreographed dance performed by vessels weighing 40 tons each. When something went wrong, as it did during their second attempt this morning, ships could come dangerously close to each other. Oars could get entangled and the entire formation could collapse into chaos. It was a humbling reminder of how much practice it took to master trireme warfare. But they continued to work at it, performing the same maneuver again and again until the coordination became second nature. This was the essence of naval training. Not just developing physical strength and endurance, though that was important, but developing that automatic, instinctive teamwork that would function even under the stress of actual combat. By the end of the day, as training concluded and they rowed back to port, Lysander was utterly exhausted. His hands were blistered despite the calluses he had built up over years of rowing. His back and shoulders ached in a way that would likely get worse before it got better. His throat was dry from the salty spray and the effort of maintaining the breathing rhythm that heavy rowing demanded. But he was also satisfied with the day's work. The crew had performed well, steadily improving their execution of complex maneuvers. The ship responded beautifully to their efforts, demonstrating once again the remarkable engineering that made trireme warfare possible. And there was something deeply gratifying about being part of a team where each person's contribution was both essential and noticeable. As they neared Piraeus harbour, Lysander saw other naval vessels returning from their own training exercises. The sight of so many triremes moving in formation was truly impressive, a visible demonstration of Athenian naval power that helped explain how this city-state had become the dominant force in the Aegean. Tonight he would go home to his small house by the harbour, have dinner with his wife and young daughter, and rest his aching muscles. Tomorrow he would return to the ship and do it all again. It was not the glamorous life sung by poets, but it was honest work that served an important purpose. What do you think it would be like to spend your days as part of a machine made of human bodies and wooden oars, where your individual effort becomes part of something much larger and more powerful than yourself? The naval maneuvers recently completed under Lysander's command required significant financial investment, which was secured by silver coins. These valuable metallic discs passed through the hands of experts like Euclid, an influential banker whose modest yet highly successful currency exchange business was located right in the bustling agora. At this very moment, under the morning sun illuminating the heart of Athens, Euclid carefully examined a handful of drachmas offered to him by a merchant from Aegina for exchange into local currency. In the minute details of these humble silver discs, he saw a reflection of a vast saga of mutual trust, commercial prosperity, and the intricate spread of economic power throughout the ancient world. 47-year-old Euclid had dedicated most of his conscious life to studying and handling coins. His parent, a skilled silversmith, had taught his son the nuances of determining the purity of precious metals, based on their weight, hue, and characteristic ring when struck against stone. However, Euclid found himself more deeply fascinated by the economic potential of metal than its aesthetic or artistic embodiment. Money captivated him not merely as a means for commercial transactions, but as a fundamental technological achievement that served as the foundation for the formation of a complex and multifaceted civilization. The coins he examined that morning were examples of superb craftsmanship. Each was adorned with a distinct image of a sea turtle, unequivocally indicating their origin, the Eginetan mint. The silver from which they were made was of high quality, and their weight felt perfectly balanced in his palm. However, these were not Athenian drachmas, and this fact required him to immediately calculate exchange rates, carefully assess the current market demand for foreign silver, and determine the potential profit he could make, while simultaneously ensuring his client a fair and advantageous deal. A superficial glance might dismiss this operation as mundane, yet, in reality, it embodied a truly revolutionary achievement in the annals of humankind. Only a few generations ago, the vast majority of commercial transactions were conducted through barter, the direct exchange of goods for other goods, or for carefully measured portions of precious metals that had to be weighed and checked for purity in every single exchange. The advent of standardized coinage radically altered this order of things, making trade significantly faster, much more reliable, and, importantly, accessible to ordinary citizens who previously lacked the specialized knowledge to assess raw silver. Remarkably, Athens adopted the art of coinage relatively late in the historical context. City-states such as Aegina and Corinth had been successfully producing their own coins for many decades, long before Athens issued its first official silver specimens. However, when the Athenians finally set about creating their own money,